Hello, I am Viddy of Video Games for Fun, and welcome to this somewhat unique first impressions video. To provide some background information for this, I have heard of but never played Shenmue or Shenmue 2. I never owned a Dreamcast, and I haven't really played much on the Dreamcast anyway, and for the longest time I thought that's what I would have to do to play Shenmue before Shenmue 3 comes out. But now that Shenmue 1 and even Shenmue 2 are on contemporary systems, which gave me a good opportunity to play it for my very first time, what are my thoughts on it? Having meaning to play for a long time, is it good? Let's find out. First of all, here's what I knew about Shenmue besides its release on the Dreamcast. The story is about Ryo avenging his father's death. It was one of the first games in history to feature quick-time events. It's slow-paced. It's different, very different to other games. The gameplay is different. So, I expect it to be quite a different game to other games that I played, but it's more different than different. So I kept my expectations stable for playing the game for the first time, because I've heard some people that it's not aged well, or some people say, oh my gosh, it's a masterpiece, you have to play it, even if it means taking time off work. Don't take time off work, okay? And I have played Shenmue for, as of this recording, 2.5 hours, and some of you who have either played the game or at least have a good indication of what the game is might be saying, 2.5 hours? That's probably not enough time to understand this different, slow-paced, interesting game, all that stuff. And you'd be right. I already knew the pace of the game was slow, but I will come back to that. First of all, how do the production values stack up? Is it essentially a big overhaul of graphics and whatnot? Well, from what I can tell, it's essentially the same graphics as the Dreamcast, but a higher resolution. It's not meant to look more realistic or more this or more that. The graphics, I suppose, are good or decent, and maybe were more so for the time of its release on the Dreamcast, and I like it that the graphics are preserved for those who have not played the game before, or at least want to rediscover it, and I guess I'll come back to that too. Though I will admit that much of the animation and the way the world looks is not up to the standards of what one would expect from a contemporary game. The lip-syncing animations and the facial expressions and whatnot are very limited, and much of the way the locations look is not exactly good, but the graphics are good for the time and are at least serviceable today. And very quickly on the music, I don't have much to say about it. Music seemed to be used sparingly as far as I'm concerned, focusing more on atmosphere, which I'm absolutely okay with. There was definitely more music in the intro and other cutscenes, and there's even that sort of kind of dark music when you read Ryo's journal. Now the story, what exactly is it like, considering its slow pace and what I knew of its premise? Well, the story does certainly seem to be compelling, and there's a bit of a mystery to it, which is interesting, or potentially interesting to unravel through gameplay, although I'll come back to that. I kind of like the slow pace of it, to the point where I kind of felt relaxed. It's kind of refreshing, maybe, in some cases, to play a game where you can just take your time a little bit. You don't have to rush everywhere, go to this point, go to that point all the time. Although going to this point or that point, as in most other games, is kind of different in Shenmue, and I guess I'm about to tell you why. When I said before the gameplay is more different than different from what I expected, for one thing, there's a lot of talking in the game, generally consisting of getting to know the characters, asking questions, and trying to figure out what's going on or what you have to do next. One of the things I didn't necessarily know about in the game was the use of a search mode, where you essentially go into first-person view mode and move the stick around to try and interact with what's in front of you, such as opening a cupboard or getting an item to buy. Also, there is the concept of time, where you get out of bed in the morning and you go around and talk to people and do things, and the time of day changes. Some places will only be open at certain times of the day, you only see certain people at certain times of the day, and from what I've seen in the manual, while you can take your time with completing the game, you have to complete it by the time spring blossoms with cherry blossoms. And I think it's summer in Shenmue 2. So this is essentially an open world game where you do have to complete the main quest, I guess, by that time. The time aspect does seem to be a little bit similar to Majora's Mask. Pity you can't rewind time, I guess. Where where as far as I'm aware, you have to not just make sure you go to places or people at certain times, but also finish as much as you can in one day in terms of game time. So you get up in the morning, do stuff, and you have to get back home and sleep at night. The only problem with the time function, as far as I'm aware, is that it just seems, even for a game, somewhat unrealistic. Like, if Rio takes about a minute to walk from one place to another, like from this house over there to the house not far, it feels like, according to the clock on the screen, a few minutes have passed. I'm not sure what to think about that. And I am also not sure what to make of the controls, which to me were difficult to get to grips with, to the point where it seemed like an old Resident Evil game was easier to control. Turning Rio around in the direction you want to face can be hard. It can be hard to line yourself up with doors and people. Well, I guess it can take a little bit of time to get used to. I don't exactly hate it, but it can be argued that that's probably one of the aspects that's not aged well, but at least it's preserved in the PlayStation 4 release in terms of button placement and the way the character moves, so I guess that's a Dreamcast re-experience, if you want to call it that. Also, speaking of the controls, some of the training and tutorial stuff does seem a bit vague as far as I'm concerned. There was a moment where I learned a kung fu move, but I wasn't given any controls, mostly. Maybe I was supposed to read the combat moves system a bit more thoroughly, but yeah, that's what I thought. It just seemed a little bit vague. Also, one of the aspects I also struggled with in terms of moving Rio around was the search mode. I had a bit of trouble moving the control stick around to know what to interact with, such as opening cupboards and whatnot. But still, it was an interesting concept, but I didn't necessarily expect. I kind of like the idea of the open world aspect of the game, though I do have some problems with it. First up, unless I'm supposed to look for it in the game at this point, or I'm supposed to draw it on my own piece of paper. Hey, remember those days where you played old games and you used to draw maps? Please, a map would be nice, especially that there's an interesting concept about getting into bed at the end of the day in the game. A map, please. A map between Rio's house and the surrounding areas. I mean, the locations I've explored so far don't seem like terribly big, but they are still streets and blocks and roads and all that stuff to the point where I don't know where to go, or I can't remember where a shop is or a place is. Sometimes characters will give you directions such as, oh, if you're looking for this place, it is opposite this place, or stuff like that. But a map, please? I don't know. In regards to the open world aspect of the game, you are not necessarily given waypoints as to where you're supposed to go or who you're supposed to talk to. It seems like you'll run into cutscenes, at least one of which had QuickTime events for me, but I don't have much of a concrete opinion on that, where you'll talk to characters or do stuff and the story progresses forward. Like I said before, a good portion of the time you're talking to people and Rio is asking questions. At first you'll be asking about men in suits, which involved the incident of his father's death, but more questions will become more open to you, such as, did you see this car? Or did you see the person who saw this car? Or aspects of that, although I will come back to an aspect of that asking question stuff I don't like. With the open world aspect, you can obtain collectibles, get items, and even play arcade games. And there are other fun little diversions apparently in the game. So you can play Space Harrier and Hainon, though when I played the Hainon, this motorbike game I haven't really heard of before, there weren't instructions for it, and it took me a few minutes to figure out that I had to hold down the R2 button to accelerate. And so I guess I spent a little bit more credit than I thought I would. Oh, maybe that's where the instructions to the game is. I didn't check. So there are fun little diversions, although I'm not sure what to make of the collectible side of things. Maybe it's not exactly that useful. And again, it's more about progressing the story. In regards to the story, like I said before, I liked the slow pace, and some of the moments or scenes seem to be quite heartfelt and poignant, and very well presented, even for a Dreamcast sort of a game. But I find the voice acting to be inconsistent. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And I primarily play the game in English, although I did watch the intro in Japanese not long ago, and I'm inclined to think, I mean, it makes sense of course, that the Japanese voices are better, even though I used English subs. And in regards to the presentation of the story, or at least the general gameplay concept of talking to people, while the dialogue is not terrible, some of it is extremely repetitive. Most of the time, when Rio is talking to people, it will essentially be the question that he is asking at that moment to progress the story, such as, did you see this person? Did you see receiver's car. Even with minor variations, it can be annoying, especially when you're not sure who you have to talk to next. And there's other repetitive dialogue, especially when Rio says, "I see."
I see. I see. I see.
So, after 2.5 hours with the game and having done 2 days of its game time, story and whatnot, what do I think? Well, I will say this. I am intrigued enough to certainly play more of Shenmue and quite possibly even play Shenmue 2 afterwards. I suppose it has not necessarily aged well, though I'm glad to see it preserved in some form on the PlayStation 4 that I played it on. And it is certainly a very different game, certainly a slow-paced game. Some of the aspects that make Shenmue stand out from other games, including its slow pace, are what particularly intrigued me about the game. I do find the story suitably compelling so far from what I've seen, and I'll certainly look forward to figuring out more of what's going on. It's not like I'm just going to spend the entire day in the game, or maybe even the entire day in real life, just playing some arcade games, or playing, I guess, darts, and doing the gambling stuff, and doing collectibles and all that stuff. So, as far as I can tell, if you've never played Shenmue before, playing it on a contemporary system does certainly seem to be the way to go. And it does pique my interest or intrigue for Shenmue 3, which reminds me of the fact that there's meant to be more than 3 Shenmue games, it's meant to be a big story, but I'm not going to dwell on that right now. All I can say is that my impressions of Shenmue are positive. I'm intrigued, even though there are some aspects of it that just do not sit well with me. Some of you may say it's a masterpiece or something from its time, and you have to understand that, and I'm totally on board with that, and I'm definitely going to play more of Shenmue. So on that note, thank you people so much for watching, and have a good day or night or whatever it is, and I will see you soon for the next video. Yeah, bye!